Yes. Councilmember Ravel,
Here.
Councilmember Hedikatis,
Here.
and then is, not, I don't believe so. I believe, is Councilmember Nusma and Councilmember Harris on this committee? No? Okay. All right. With that, we are calling the meeting to order. We have approval of the minutes. We have moved by Councilmember Nguyen, seconded by
Second.
Councilmember Hedikatis. All those in favor, say aye. All those opposed, any abstentions? The ayes have it. That leads us to public comment. We have Tina Payton signed up for public comment. You have 2 minutes. Starting.
Hi, good evening. This agenda item tonight should not be heard. You need to have community meetings, and they should be hybrid so everyone can attend to discuss what should happen in the Fifth Ward. City staff and aldermen should not be deciding on what to do with the city without questions, answers, and comments with all parties. That includes us, the citizens, if you claim to be fair and transparent. So far, there has been no discussion on Emerson and Jackson. It was not even a discussion to buy the property with the community. There has been no discussion on purchasing 1808 Hovland. There has been very little discussion on Church and Darrow. There's been no discussion on the townhomes at the dead end of Wesley and Jackson, which is proposed. No discussion on tearing down Fleetwood Jourdain or any other things that you're discussing in the Fifth Ward. There should be a minimum of 10 meetings where city staff and aldermen can take notes, answer questions from the community. I believe that you need to set up some regular meetings with the staff at this time and not proceed on any discussion, one-sided conversation with the
15 seconds.
city staff. Thank you. Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. Is there anyone else signed up for our hybrid public meeting?
I think Carlos Sutton wanted to speak. I'm not sure if he's
We
on.
have,
The next person is Jean Linwell.
Hi.
go ahead, Ms. Linwell.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Jean Lindwall. I think most of you know that I'm a member of the Land Use Commission. And actually, when the project moves forward, I'm the chair of the Comprehensive Plan Subcommittee of the Land Use Commission. But I want to speak, really as a longtime resident and someone who has spent 40-plus years doing land use and comprehensive planning and neighborhood planning. And what I really want to do is just really talk a little bit about the difference between the West Evanston Plan and the West Evanston Zoning Overlay District, because they're really two different things. A plan is a policy guide, and in Evanston we have the Comprehensive Plan, which is the general land use and development guidance. The West Evanston Plan that was adopted in 2007 contains specific recommendations for new streets and development types that were intended to reconnect the two sides of the old Mayfair line. Zoning is a tool for implementing goals, objectives, and policies of a plan. In the case of the West Evanston Overlay District, the rules were highly rigid and per the examples provided in the staff memo. And as they mentioned, have proven problematic as new land use and development proposals are brought forward. I think what's really crucial here is it's important to periodically review plans. Priorities may change, new opportunities could arise, And, if the policy emphasis changes, then the zoning that's in place may not, to implement the original plan, may no longer be appropriate. And just kind of as a general rule of thumb, it's important to revisit plans typically in a community like Evanston every 10 to 15 years. And if you look at the West Evanston plan in particular, it was adopted before the financial crisis in 2008, which really changed a lot of development dynamics. It called for the construction of new streets, which, obviously you're dealing with a pretty healthy list of community capital improvement projects and really redevelopment that was articulated in the plan was dedicated to that.
15
achieving
seconds.
that vision. And I think that I will agree with Tina and all the other neighbors who have spoken over time. It's really critical that this process be a community process. But I think it's important to, as you move forward with a discussion, to, separate policy from implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have
Nobody else on the list, if there's anybody online.
seeing no one online and seeing no one in the audience. We're going to move forward with this Planning and Development Committee meeting. With no items for consideration, we just have an item for discussion. May I have a motion on item D1?
So moved. Second.
Item D1 moved by Councilmember Burns. For discussion of the West Evanston Plan and Overlay Area and its impact on current and future development. And that was seconded by Councilmember Nusma. Discussion? I don't believe there's a staff presentation. Correct. Councilmember Burns.
Yes. So I don't think this was a referral, but asked for this discussion to take place. So Church and Darrow is a good example. At some point, assuming if the Church and Darrow project gets through the Land Use Commission, it will come to this body to determine whether or not to relieve it from all the variances that it will, or to approve the variances it will request. And so ahead of that, I thought it made sense for this body to understand the West Evanston overlay, why was it put in place, how it impacts past developments as well as developments that are making their way to this body to vote on. And again, this isn't, we'll, through the comp plan, we'll think through whether or not the West Evanston overlay and other decisions we made still make sense. So this is not an attempt to try to remove or change anything. This is not the process to do it, nor really the venue to do it or the time to do it. This was more so saying, again, we have projects in the pipeline that are going to ask for variances because of the overlay. I thought it was important for us not to just learn about it on the fly or at some future meeting when it's in our packet, but to really know in advance what the overlay is and why developers are going to be asking for relief from it, to be honest. So if we, could have a quick walkthrough of this, I don't know if who's available to speak, but I would like folks to talk a bit about it and to see if we have any. I have some questions, but see if my colleagues have questions as well.
We have Melissa Klotz, our zoning administrator, who can,
Oh, I thought you were going to be
she
virtual today.
is able to be here.
Okay, good to see you.
Good evening. Thank you, Councilmember Burns and Planning and Development Committee. Melissa Klotz, Zoning Administrator. I have dealt with the West Evanston Plan and Overlay for over 10 years here. There are some parts of it that have worked very well. There are other parts of it that have not worked so well. Some of the projects that are in the future pipeline, including the Mount Pisgah rebuild and HODC building, slated for Church and Darrow, those have been great examples of two great projects that just don't fit well within the overlay. And it comes down to some of the the minute details that are within the overlay district. So projects like this, they tend to follow the general intent of the plan and the guidance of that, but then once you get into those overlay details, that's where they end up with problems. For instance, the Mount Pisgah Church, it is required to have a certain type of stoop entrance. That stoop would not be ADA accessible. So that would be a variation that they'll need to request. So there's some things like that where we really just want to make sure that everyone is aware that the plan is a good plan that was developed by the community. There are some issues with it, and those issues really come to light within the overlay district. So whether we're looking at Mount Pisgah and HODC or some other sites that are also slated for redevelopment, some of those other sites need new streets. Those streets would be required to be developed and built by private developers. They would then turn over to the city for maintenance permanently. So some of those properties, while it's a problem for developers, it also could potentially be an issue in the future for the city. So those are some of the things that just the plan itself can guide us on, and potentially people could request variations to differ from those plans. But if they are requesting those variations, that means that they are not following all aspects of the overlay district.
How does the West Evanston overlay impact kind of height and density, especially with Church and Darrow or similar projects?
The overlay does not regulate density, which is that's almost a newer zoning concept, and that's one that tends to work very well. It's what can you fit within the appropriate box that the building would be, and however many dwelling units you can fit in there, then that's what's allowed. So density-wise, it's pretty good. Height-wise, I've seen many problems arise. The overlay dictates exact properties and tells you exactly what those heights are. And for instance, the very corner of Church and Darrow is limited to 2 stories. That might have been appropriate 15 years ago, but looking how things are redeveloping, that's a prime corner. And the plan does call for it to be an iconic building, a building that will draw everyone's attention, everyone will be looking at that building, but then limiting it at 2 stories. So for instance, Mount Pisgah has this great idea for a partially enclosed rooftop area so that they can have some community things that are somewhat outdoors. That's not allowed by the overlay because it's over the 2 stories, so that's a variation that they'll need to request. Given that location, that might be appropriate for that height and doing that there, but again, it's the overlay that won't allow it.
If I can interject, Councilmember Nguyen.
Yes, thank you. So I remember voting on the overlay and the West Evanston plan as well. And I remember how exciting it was at the time, the level of detail, but I think Ms. Lindwall was right. I mean, it was before the Great Recession, and housing has changed dramatically in Evanston. Housing and development has changed dramatically. So what should we declare the overlay void and start again? What is the recommendation?
Overall, staff is not recommending anything. Largely, it's just that we want everyone to be aware that we're in this situation where we have some zoning regulations that are outdated and may not be working well for the community. A plan that largely does work well for the community, but maybe not every aspect of it. While we are in the beginning stages of a new comprehensive plan, which means we don't want to largely change existing things that we have, but at the same time, we do not want to stifle good projects or development over these next couple of years just because we're in the middle of updating things. So we just want to make sure everyone understands that typically speaking, projects that run through the land use process should not be requesting 10, 15, 20 variations. typically that means that the project needs to be adjusted. This is kind of the opposite case, where maybe it's not the projects that need to be adjusted, maybe it's our plans and our overlays.
So this is giving us the heads up that something that's coming through that's within this overlay district that comes along with a Christmas tree of variances, that there are reasons for that.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Hadid-Cuttis, followed by Councilmember Ravel, then Nusma.
Would you say it'd be doable for staff to put together like a list of problematic portions of the overlay so that we could have and correspond those to possible variances? So like when projects do come through, we can easily flag it as this is like something we've kind of forecasted as, something we'd have to change in the future?
Definitely. We could put together a kind of generic list of that, but then the real kind of meat of it would be any projects that do proceed on to City Council for approval that have that laundry list of variations. Staff gets very specific explaining why those variations are requested, and within that staff report, it would end up saying that some of these regulations are not appropriate and shouldn't be there to begin with.
Thank you, Councilmember Ravel.
So some of these items that you've mentioned just seem so detailed and minute, and not the kinds of things that I anticipate we'll be talking about in the comprehensive general plan, which is a much more, has much more sweeping kinds of statements. And so at some point, we are going to want to try to amend this overlay district.
Correct. The new comprehensive plan should be the guiding document that determines what happens with all of the current neighborhood and community plans that we have, the West Evanston plan being one of those. So the new comp plan will then dictate what should come next. Should it be that all of the neighborhood plans are all amended, or should only a few of them be amended? And then after those plans, any corresponding overlays, those then need to follow the updated or amended plans. So that's why it's a multi-year out process as it specifically relates to the overlay. And it would be very in-depth to adjust anything within it now, and we really need to do a lot more community engagement with the comprehensive plan in order to get to that point. So at this point, really, it's just a heads up that we know it's not exactly what the community needs.
And so it really does sound as though we're going to have several years of potentially of projects coming to us that are going to need these kinds of variances.
It could be.
Okay.
Thank you, Councilmember Nusma.
I think Councilmember Ravel asked the question I was going to ask, but let me just read it back to you and tell me if I'm understanding this correctly. We got an old plan, doesn't really make sense, but we're not going to cancel it right now. We're going to wait until the comprehensive plan is done, which is a couple years out realistically, and only at that point will we then potentially address the neighborhood plan here. In the meantime, heads up to expect if development's coming to us with a laundry list of variances that we would expect to not be there once the plan is revised.
Correct.
But we don't want to just strike the plan and cancel the plan right now because we still need some guidelines to be in place.
We need some kind of plan and regulation to be in place. There are a lot of good things about the current plan and regulation, so we don't want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And probably most importantly is we need to hear from the community before we would know how to change it in any way if we want to.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, seeing that there is no more discussion on this issue, thank you, Councilmember Burns.
Just one last question. Does the overlay change its considerations or requirements based on the different zones? Or is it one overlay same requirements, same considerations, but
There
it
are
changes,
so
right?
many different
Right,
regulations.
yeah.
There are sub-areas,
Right.
and then even within the sub-areas, specific properties are called out for exact specific things. It gets detailed down to within inches of where you must put very specific buildings and what they must look like, and streets and all of that. But it's all very different, which also leads to, it is very difficult for staff. It takes probably 5 times as long to do staff reviews on properties that are in the West Evanston overlay, just because there are so many of those details.
And I think to Councilmember Hedekata's point, if we can, at least on Church and Darrow, provide the council with the current requirements, and not necessarily, Land Use Commission still has to do their review, but just the requirements on that, in that zone or in that area, I think that would be helpful, just so they can take a look at it. And then eventually we'll see which ones, they're requesting a variance for. But in the meantime, if we can get that to them, I think that'd be helpful.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all.
Okay, seeing no further discussion. I'm sorry, I think we did approve the minutes. I think Councilmember Nguyen made the motion. Okay, well, seeing no further business before us, are there any items for communication? Seeing no items for communication, the Planning and Development meeting is now adjourned, and council.